September 15th, 1951. The Pacific lay gray and endless, the water beaten flat by wind, and a war that raged without clear resolution. On the deck of a U.S. Navy transport ship, a cluster of Korean women stood huddled in their thin clothes, their eyes wide, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of the sea. Some were nurses captured on Pacific islands, others clerks or civilians who had been swept into the chaos of retreat. Their faces were pale, framed by dark hair knotted carelessly, and their expressions carried the exhaustion of a nation divided. They had grown up on posters that painted Americans as cruel capitalist beasts, demons with claws and fangs. Yet now they found themselves guarded by young men in pressed khaki, men who spoke in unfamiliar accents, men who neither spat at them nor struck them, but instead offered cigarettes or water as if to strangers, not enemies. The women could hardly reconcile the scene before them with the warnings drilled into them through years of communist propaganda. The ship creaked as it cut toward the American coast, carrying the weight of capture across the ocean. The women were silent at first, their bodies close, their breaths visible in the cool morning air. Some clutched the remnants of possessions, worn satchels, faded photographs, a folded hanbok hidden under military-issued blankets. Each woman carried with her not just belongings, but a story of how she had survived capture. One, a nurse of 28, had been stationed in a field hospital on Incheon, where she watched friends flee south rather than fall into American hands. Another, barely 21, had been working as a typist in a garrison office when UN troops surrounded the city. A third, older than the rest, had been caring for children in a school compound when retreat swept them all into captivity. Their journeys were different, but they shared the same dread. What awaited them in the enemy land? The Americans on board were boys, many no older than the women themselves. Farms from Iowa, steel workers from Pennsylvania, baseball players from Texas, now transformed into sailors and guards. They walked the deck with casual authority, rifles slung loosely, smiles flickering when they caught the prisoners staring at them. One soldier, amused, held out a Lucky Strike cigarette, tapping the pack with 2 fingers before extending it like a peace offering. The women recoiled at first, unsure if it was a trick. When one finally accepted, her hands trembling, the soldier only nodded and lit it for her. It was a simple gesture, but it cracked something in the wall of fear built up over years of indoctrination. These were not monsters. They were unsettlingly just men. The sea voyage was long, and time aboard the transport blurred. Meals arrived at regular intervals, trays of bread, soup, sometimes even meat. The women were stunned by the abundance. Though some could not swallow it, their stomachs knotted by nerves. Another laughed. Yeah, good thing Park's around. She can translate quick. The laughter stung, sharper than before, because this time the stakes were real. This wasn't just about their pride or their place in the world's pecking order. This was about survival. The women drew closer together, whispering in Korean about what they observed. They looked like film stars. One said, her voice barely audible above the wind. Too tall, too clean. Another said she thought their smiles were frightening, too open, too free. A third admitted that the tall soldiers made her feel invisible, like a child. They laughed nervously, but beneath the laughter lay unease. If everything they had been told was false, what else was a lie? If the enemy was not grotesque, but handsome, not vicious, but courteous, then what had all the suffering been for? Their minds wrestled with questions they could not yet answer. The days passed, marked by bells and meals, the endless hiss of the ocean. Slowly the women adjusted, though fear never left entirely. They noticed details now. The way the Americans teased each other, the way one whistled a tune while polishing his boots, the way another prayed quietly at night, head bowed. Such ordinary acts seemed extraordinary. The women had been prepared for cruelty, yet instead they saw rituals of normal life. It was disarming, confusing, and strangely painful, for it reminded them of what their own brothers and husbands might have been if war had not consumed everything. On the morning of September 22nd, the shoreline finally appeared. A faint line, then a shape, then the unmistakable outline of America. The women pressed to the rails, their hearts quickening. For some, fear surged again. What trials awaited in this vast, capitalist land? For others, curiosity flared. The tall guards stood near them, gazing toward home, their postures easy, as if they were returning from a long shift rather than ending a police action. The contrast was almost unbearable. The prisoners were crossing into a land they had been taught to hate, a land that would now decide their fates. Yet standing beside them were men whose very presence contradicted every warning and caricature they had believed. The ship groaned as it neared the harbor, gulls circling above, the air sharper with the scent of land. One of the women, clutching her satchel, whispered to the nurse beside her, "If they're not monsters, then what are they?" It was a question heavy with both dread and wonder. The nurse had no answer. She only stared at the American docks rising from the horizon, where more soldiers waited, taller, broader, cleaner than she had imagined. Her pulse quickened. The journey across the ocean was ending, but the greater journey was only beginning. For what awaited them on American soil was not brutality, but something far stranger and perhaps even more unsettling. The harbor rose from the mist like a promise and a threat. Wooden piers stretched into the water. Cranes swung lazily overhead, and the smell of oil, salt, and coal drifted toward the transport ship as it eased closer to land. For the Korean women on deck, every detail carved itself into memory. They clutched their satchels and stared through the fog at the figures gathering along the docks. Rows of American soldiers stood waiting, their uniforms pressed, rifles resting casually, their posture steady but not cruel. The women drew in sharp breath. For them, touching soil again felt like touching life. It gave rhythm to days that otherwise blurred, and always above the routine lingered the tall figures of American soldiers, living proof that the world was not what they had been told. One afternoon, a soldier carried a phonograph into the yard. He cranked it and music poured out, jazz rhythms, brassy and alive. The women froze, startled by the strange, infectious sound. Some smiled despite themselves. A few guards clapped in time, joking with one another. The nurse closed her eyes, listening, and felt tears burn at the corners. Music of all things reminded her that joy still existed, even in captivity. It was almost cruel in its beauty, yet it etched itself into memory as a moment when the walls of enmity cracked wide enough to let something human slip through. By winter, whispers of exchange began to spread. The conflict was stalemated and prisoner swaps loomed. For many women, the thought of returning to Korea was bittersweet. They longed for home, yet feared what home had become. News filtered in of rubble, hunger, and grief. To leave the camp meant to face a nation reshaped by division. Strangely, for some, the fences no longer felt only like prison. They felt like shelter from a harsher reality waiting beyond. When the day of departure drew near, the women gathered their belongings. They folded their coats, tied bundles, and lined up once again for transport. The nurse looked back at the camp one final time. The barracks stood quietly, the fences still tall, the guards still watching. Yet in her memory, it was not the fences that remained sharp. It was the smell of bacon in the mornings, the hot showers, the polite gestures, the tall soldiers tossing a baseball in the sun. These details would travel with her long after the gates closed behind her. As the trucks rumbled toward the port, the women whispered to each other. Not of monsters, but of men. They looked like film stars, one said again. This time without shame, another added softly. They treated us better than we expected. The nurse remained silent, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She felt a shift inside her, not toward love or admiration, but toward something heavier, the knowledge that truth had been more complicated than she had ever believed, or had been built on lies. But in captivity, she had glimpsed something undeniable. At the harbor, the ships waited, gray hulks ready to return them to the divided Korea. The women climbed aboard, their satchels clutched, their hearts torn. Behind them, America receded, a land of contradiction, of conflict and unexpected mercy, of tall, handsome men who had shattered every story they had been told. As the ship's engines roared to life, the nurse pressed her hands together and whispered a prayer, not for victory, not for revenge, but for understanding. She did not yet know what awaited in her homeland, but she knew one truth would remain with her forever. The enemy had looked into her eyes and treated her as human, and that memory, both painful and luminous, would not fade. The journey back across the Pacific felt different from their arrival. The same gray water stretched endlessly, but the women no longer huddled in fear. They stood at the rails watching the American coastline disappear, carrying with them questions that would outlast the war itself. Some spoke quietly of the hot showers they had never expected, the medical care that contradicted every propaganda poster, the guards who had shown them photographs of wives and children back home. Others remained silent, wrestling with truths that challenged everything they had believed about their enemies. The nurse found herself thinking not of the fences or the barracks, but of small moments that had revealed humanity where she expected brutality. A young soldier sharing his ration chocolate with a sick prisoner. Guards who learned Korean phrases to communicate better. The phonograph music that had made her cry not from sadness, but from a recognition that beauty could exist even in captivity. These memories felt dangerous, subversive to everything she had been taught. Yet they were undeniably real, carved into her consciousness with the precision of lived experience. As Korea appeared on the horizon, the women prepared for whatever awaited them. Some would speak of their treatment, others would keep silent. But all carried within them the complicated truth that enemies could be human, that propaganda could lie, and that war was far more complex than the simple narratives that had driven them to conflict. The nurse touched the small photograph in her pocket, not of family, but of the American camp where she had learned that understanding was more powerful than hatred. The processing center buzzed with activity as the Korean women were led through a series of stations. Medical examinations revealed the careful attention Americans paid to prisoner welfare. Clean facilities, proper lighting, nurses who spoke gently while checking for injuries or illness. The women exchanged glances, remembering propaganda images of torture chambers and experimentation. Instead, they found themselves receiving treatment better than many had experienced in their own country's hospitals. Hot showers followed, the first many had enjoyed in months. Steam filled the tiled rooms as the women stood under cascading water, washing away not just the grime of travel, but layers of fear that had accumulated during their capture. Clean towels waited, soft and warm, along with fresh clothing that fit properly. Simple gestures, yet they spoke of a regard for human dignity that contradicted every warning they had received. The barracks were Spartan but clean, with real beds and blankets that smelled of soap rather than mildew. Windows let in natural light, and heating kept the autumn chill at bay. The women explored their new quarters cautiously, expecting tricks or traps, finding instead an environment designed for basic comfort rather than punishment. Meals arrived on schedule, served by Korean interpreters who had volunteered to help ease the transition. Rice appeared alongside American foods, acknowledging their dietary preferences. Portions were generous, nutrition adequate, presentation respectful. The abundance continued to shock women who had grown accustomed to wartime rationing and the uncertainty of military campaigns. Evening brought the first real test of their captors' intentions. No interrogations, no demands for military information, no threats or intimidation. Instead, guards maintained respectful distance while ensuring security. The women were left to process their situation, to begin understanding that their expectations of American brutality were proving systematically false. As darkness fell over the camp, the nurse lay on her clean bed, listening to the quiet breathing of other women. Outside, American soldiers walked their posts with the casual competence of men doing routine work rather than guarding dangerous enemies. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, forcing her to confront the possibility that everything she had believed about this war was incomplete. Daily routines established themselves with surprising normalcy. The women were assigned to work details that felt more like purposeful activity than forced labor. Some tended gardens that would feed the camp. Others assisted in the laundry or kitchen facilities. The work was voluntary, compensated with small privileges, and supervised by guards who offered instruction rather than commands. The nurse found herself assigned to the camp medical facility, where her training was not only recognized but valued. American doctors treated her as a colleague rather than a prisoner, asking her opinion on treatments and learning Korean medical terminology to better communicate with patients. The respect was bewildering, completely contrary to everything she had expected about American attitudes toward Korean professionals. Male privileges arrived within weeks, allowing the women to write carefully censored letters to families back home. The censorship was explained openly, conducted by Korean-speaking personnel who removed only military information while preserving personal messages. Some women received responses, evidence that their captivity was being handled through proper diplomatic channels rather than the disappearances they had feared. Recreation time included access to books, many translated into Korean, along with games and craft materials. Guards organized volleyball matches, teaching rules and playing alongside prisoners with casual friendliness that would have been unthinkable under their previous understanding of American character. The competitive spirit transcended language barriers, creating moments of genuine laughter between former enemies. Educational opportunities emerged as some guards discovered women with teaching backgrounds. English lessons began informally, with soldiers practicing Korean phrases while teaching American words in return. These exchanges revealed the intellectual curiosity and basic decency of young men who had been portrayed as savage invaders in communist propaganda materials. Weather turned colder as autumn progressed into winter, bringing additional clothing and heating that maintained comfort rather than mere survival. The contrast with Korean prison conditions became impossible to ignore. These Americans were spending resources to ensure prisoner welfare that exceeded basic international requirements. The investment in humane treatment spoke to values that challenged fundamental assumptions about capitalist society and American militarism that had shaped their worldview. Winter brought unexpected celebrations as American holidays arrived at the camp. Thanksgiving introduced the women to traditions completely foreign to their experience. Yet guards made efforts to explain the cultural significance while sharing abundant meals that included both American dishes and Korean adaptations prepared by sympathetic cooks. The gesture of inclusion felt revolutionary to women who had expected isolation and hostility. Christmas preparations revealed another dimension of American character that propaganda had never acknowledged. Guards decorated common areas with lights and greenery, organized gift exchanges among prisoners, and arranged special meals that demonstrated remarkable attention to prisoner morale. Some women received small presents, handmade items, or books that showed individual guards had been paying attention to personal interests and preferences. Religious services were offered for those who wanted them, conducted by chaplains who respected diverse faiths rather than attempting conversion. The tolerance surprised women who had been taught that Americans forced their beliefs on others. Instead, they found accommodation for different spiritual practices and respect for personal choices about participation in religious activities. Guard rotations brought new faces regularly, each group maintaining the same standards of professional courtesy that had characterized their treatment from arrival. The consistency suggested institutional policies rather than individual kindness, indicating that humane treatment of prisoners was systematically enforced rather than dependent on random compassion from specific personnel. Personal relationships began developing despite language barriers and political differences. Guards learned individual names, remembered personal details shared during conversations, and showed genuine interest in Korean culture and history. Some women found themselves teaching traditional songs or explaining cultural practices to curious Americans who approached such exchanges with respect rather than mockery. The nurse observed these interactions with growing confusion about everything she had believed regarding American attitudes toward other peoples. These men seemed genuinely interested in understanding Korean perspectives rather than dismissing or denigrating them. The cognitive dissonance became overwhelming as months of observation contradicted years of indoctrination about American character and intentions toward Korean people and culture. Spring arrived with news that armistice negotiations were progressing at Panmunjom, bringing mixed emotions to the camp. The women gathered around radio broadcasts translated by interpreters, learning that prisoner exchanges were being discussed as part of broader peace talks. For many, the prospect of returning to Korea created anxiety rather than simple joy. What version of their homeland would they find after years of devastating conflict? Reports filtered through of a country divided permanently along the 38th parallel, families separated by political boundaries, cities reduced to rubble by constant warfare. The Korea they remembered from before capture might no longer exist, replaced by a fractured nation struggling to rebuild under competing ideologies. Some women expressed fears about reintegration into Korean society after months of exposure to American culture and values. The camp had become a strange sanctuary where international tensions faded into personal relationships and shared daily experiences. Outside these fences waited political realities that might not welcome women who had been influenced by extended contact with enemy forces. The nurse found herself torn between longing for home and reluctance to leave an environment where she had discovered unexpected truths about human nature. Her medical work with American doctors had shown her advances in treatment and technology that could benefit Korean patients, yet she wondered whether such knowledge would be welcomed or viewed with suspicion by authorities back home. Guard discussions revealed that many Americans also felt conflicted about the approaching prisoner exchanges. Relationships had developed that transcended military protocol, creating personal connections that would be severed by political agreements. Some guards had learned enough Korean to conduct meaningful conversations, while women had acquired English skills that facilitated genuine communication across cultural boundaries. The approaching separation highlighted how artificial the barriers between enemies had become when individuals interacted with mutual respect and curiosity. Daily routines continued, but with underlying awareness that this unusual community was temporary. The garden work, volleyball games, language lessons, and shared meals would soon end, replaced by return to societies that maintained the hostilities these personal experiences had undermined. The official announcement came through camp loudspeakers on a humid July morning. Prisoner exchanges would begin within 2 weeks as part of the armistice agreement signed at Panmunjom. The women gathered their few possessions with careful deliberation, folding clean clothes provided by their captors, organizing letters and small gifts received from guards who had become unlikely friends rather than enemies. Final medical examinations ensured each woman was healthy enough for travel and reintegration. American doctors provided detailed medical records translated into Korean, along with medications for ongoing treatments. The thoroughness demonstrated continued concern for prisoner welfare, even as custody transferred back to Korean authorities. Several women requested permission to write letters of gratitude, carefully worded expressions of appreciation for treatment that exceeded international requirements and personal expectations. These letters were reviewed by censors who seemed moved by the genuine sentiment expressed toward guards and medical staff who had provided care during captivity. The nurse spent her final days in the medical facility, working alongside American doctors who had treated her as a valued colleague. They provided her with medical text translated into Korean, along with documentation of new treatment procedures that could benefit patients back home. The professional respect had transformed her understanding of international cooperation in medical fields. Farewell gatherings were organized in the recreation hall, where women and guards shared final meals and exchanged addresses for potential future correspondence. Some guards had prepared small gifts, books, or photographs that could be treasured as reminders of unexpected friendships formed across enemy lines. The emotional weight of these separations surprised everyone involved. Language lessons continued until the final day, with women teaching Korean phrases to guards while practicing English expressions they might need during repatriation processing. These exchanges had evolved far beyond military necessity into genuine cultural sharing that would influence both groups long after separation. As departure day approached, the nurse walked through the camp one final time, memorizing details that contradicted every expectation she had held about American prison camps. Clean facilities, respectful treatment, educational opportunities, and medical care that exceeded many civilian hospitals back home. The trucks arrived at dawn, their engines rumbling through the morning quiet as guards formed orderly lines for the final departure. Women climbed aboard with their small bundles, taking last looks at barracks that had housed them for nearly 2 years. The camp that had initially terrified them now felt like sanctuary compared to the uncertainties waiting beyond the gates. As the convoy moved toward the port, the nurse pressed her face against the window, watching American countryside roll past. Fields of corn stretched toward horizons. Farmhouses dotted the landscape, and children waved from school buses in scenes of normalcy that contrasted sharply with the devastated Korea she expected to find upon return. The women whispered to each other during the journey, sharing observations that would have been impossible to voice months earlier. They looked like movie stars, one said again, her voice carrying wonder rather than fear. This time without shame, another added softly, they treated us better than our own officers sometimes did. The nurse remained silent, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, processing memories that would challenge her understanding forever. At the port, Liberty ships waited with Korean flags flying alongside American colors, visual symbols of the complex negotiations that had secured their release. Red Cross officials supervised the transfer process, ensuring documentation was complete and medical needs addressed. The professionalism extended to the final moments of American custody. Guards who had supervised their daily lives for months offered final handshakes and expressions of goodwill. Some exchanged addresses despite regulations, hoping to maintain connections formed through shared humanity rather than military protocol. These gestures represented personal bonds that transcended political divisions and would survive long after the war ended. The nurse looked back at the American port one final time as Korean officials began processing the returned prisoners. Behind her stood tall soldiers who had shattered every propaganda image she had believed, men whose kindness had forced her to confront the complexity of international conflict and human nature. Their treatment had revealed truths about dignity, respect, and compassion that would influence her perspective for the remainder of her life, challenging simple narratives about enemies and allies in ways that would complicate her reintegration into Korean society. At the harbor, the ships waited, gray hulks ready to return them to the divided Korea. The women climbed aboard, their satchels clutched, their hearts torn. Behind them, America receded, a land of contradiction, of conflict and unexpected mercy, of tall, handsome men who had shattered every story they had been told. As the ship's engines roared to life, the nurse pressed her hands together and whispered a prayer, not for victory, not for revenge, but for understanding. She did not yet know what awaited in her homeland, but she knew one truth would remain with her forever. The enemy had looked into her eyes and treated her as human, and that memory, both painful and luminous, would not fade. The Pacific stretched before them once again, but this journey carried different weight than their arrival in American custody. The same gray waters that had brought them to captivity now carried them toward freedom. Yet freedom felt complicated by knowledge that challenged everything they had believed about their enemies and themselves. Some women stood at the rails watching the American coastline disappear, carrying memories that would influence their understanding of international conflict for the remainder of their lives. Others retreated to their berths, overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance between propaganda and personal experience that would require years to fully process. The nurse remained on deck until darkness obscured the last traces of American territory. In her pocket, she carried a small photograph given by one of the guards, not of family, but of the medical facility where she had worked alongside doctors who treated her as a colleague rather than a prisoner. That image would remind her that professional respect could transcend national boundaries and political ideologies. As Korea appeared on the distant horizon, the women prepared for reintegration into a society that might not welcome their complicated truths about American character and intentions. They had witnessed humanity where they expected brutality, discovered friendship where they anticipated hatred, and experienced dignity where they feared degradation. These revelations would challenge their ability to accept simple narratives about enemies and allies, forcing them to navigate a world more complex than propaganda had ever acknowledged. The ship moved steadily toward home, carrying women transformed by captivity that had revealed the inadequacy of hatred as a guide to understanding human nature across cultural and political divisions.